Welcome back to the It's Just Sport podcast. We have an incredible bonus episode for you today where myself and Niamh will take you through the various news that's going on in sport at the moment when it comes to transgender athletes. We've had some incredible feedback from our last podcast that we did where we focused on transgender athletes, and I think myself and Niamh wanted to give you a bit of an update in what's going on in the world with two substantial stories, I suppose, from our end. Well, three substantial stories, I should say. But the first one being Laurel Hubbard, who is likely to compete at the Tokyo Olympics in weightlifting. Niamh, you have all the news on everything to do with Laurel Hubbard. Fill us in on what you got.
Yeah, so basically about 2 weeks ago, it came out that Laurel Hubbard is likely to qualify for the Tokyo Olympic Games. So Laurel is an athlete from New Zealand and has been competing in weightlifting for the last couple of years. The rule that actually allows her to compete has been around since 2003, which I think has kind of begged a few questions. But I think in relation to why is the conversation happening now is because she's actually the first athlete that's looking likely that she might actually go through and make this qualification. So Hubbard is due to become the first transgender Olympic competitor and will contest at the 87 kilo plus super heavyweight division. Before transitioning in 2013, Hubbard had challenged in domestic men's weightlifting competitions, but never at international level. Since then, she has won a silver medal in the 2017 World Championships and appeared at multiple Commonwealth and Pacific Games. She has also obviously spoken on the topic. It's not something that you can avoid, and she is competing, doing what she loves, but she's aware that there is conversation and controversy around being a transgender female competing against biological women. She said, I think even 10 years ago, the world perhaps wasn't ready for an athlete like myself, and perhaps it is not ready for it now. But I got the sense, at least, that people are willing to consider me for these competitions, and it seemed like the right time to put the boots on and hit the platform. So, it's a complicated topic. But it's happening more and more. There's more conversation around it, because we've seen other sports discuss what the possibilities might be for transgender female athletes and for biological female athletes. I guess just some points are she's going to be 43 years old. She lived as a man until 2013, which would have made her 35 when she transitioned. She is competing in the 87 kilo plus super heavyweight division, which is actually a plus category. She's actually 130 kilos. I'm just giving the information, take it as you will, and she's 6 foot tall. So some of the conversation is around kind of, is there an advantage having, grown up as a man and lived as a man until she was 35 years old and then transitioned, and what is the impact on her competitors. We actually ran a poll on the Her Sport Instagram and Her Sport Twitter accounts. This got over 1,000 votes, and it was just really interesting to see what the feedback of the audience was. So 67% believes that she should not be allowed to compete at the Olympic Games, and 33% believe that she should. It's interesting that a third of people do believe that she should be allowed to compete at the Games. Interestingly, though, many of elite athletes didn't believe that it was fair, and some people actually commented on the news story that we had, who are athletes, and I guess can understand what it might be like to come up against Laurel Hubbard or a transgender female in some other sports. It's definitely a difficult topic, and I guess we can dive a little bit into the IOC guidelines.
Yeah, so I suppose in the IOC guidelines, they have stated that trans women can compete against biological women if testosterone remains below 10 nanomoles per litre for 12 months before and during competition. I suppose to put that into context, for the nanomoles per litre, women can have up to 1.79, but for men, you can have between 7.7 to about 29.
Yeah, I think what's interesting for this is under the IOC guidelines, it's under 10 nanomoles to compete. And with World Athletics, it is under 5. So they have kind of been a bit more stringent on this. The rules changed in 2015, which I think may impact things. Previously, you had to be legally registered as your new gender, you had to have reassignment surgery, and you had to have hormone therapy. So with the new guidelines since 2015, you now only have to have hormone therapy, which, you know, it does, people are asking the questions like, is that enough, you know, to make sure that, you know, people are transitioning for the right reasons. And, you know, what we're saying is simply what we're giving you the information, we're sharing like what the conversation has been, and what people are really trying to just do is talk out the conversation and find out what is fair for everybody involved. We certainly believe that there's a place in sport for everyone. It's just about figuring out like what's the fairest way for everybody to compete, and what kind of sports might have room for you know, transgender athletes to compete at elite level, because I think that's the biggest thing, is the elite level piece. I guess let's go back to the rugby story and give that bit of information, and then we can kind of talk out the other sides of it. Do you want to tell everybody about what happened in France this week in relation to rugby?
Yeah, so I suppose for anyone who isn't familiar with the story, the France's Federation of Rugby is starting to allow transgender people to play in domestic competitions, which goes against World Rugby recommendations. So I suppose for context, in rugby, over in France, transgenders who are transitioning from male to female must be on hormonal therapy for at least 12 months and have testosterone less than 5 nanomoles per litre. In October 2020, World Rugby became the first international sports federation to actually rule out transgender women playing in the elite level of women's rugby. So, according to their research, it showed that there was 20 to 30% increase in risk of injury when a female player is tackled by someone who has gone through, obviously, male puberty. There are significant physical advantages by trans women over biological women, even after taking testosterone suppressants. I wonder, do we know what those like significant? I mean, obviously, we can see them some of the times, but I wonder, do we know what those significant physical advantages are? You know, because it's very like, it's quite vague in like the way it says it. Obviously, we know they're bigger, they're strongly, potentially stronger. You know, we see that with Laurel. You know, obviously being 6 feet and 130 kilos. Not to go back to her too much. But I wonder, like, significant is just obviously a bit vague, like in my opinion.
I think if you look at the report, there is more detail on it. So it does actually go into the advantages in strength, and we actually have some more from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which we can discuss a little bit as well. I think in relation to what France Rugby have actually done, they have actually followed their players won't be allowed to play at elite level, and it was left at the discretion of each country as to what the rulings would be for transgender women to participate in sport within their country. So I actually think that France was kind of within their right to make that decision. Yep. Apparently, it was a unanimous vote that, you know, that transgender women would be allowed to participate in it, and, you know, they still will not be allowed to play at elite sport. I mean, the 20 to 30% increase in risk of injury, yes. You know, it is concerning, and it is going to have to be something that's monitored. And while they went, you know, against it, you know, it was a recommendation. So that is down to the country to then decide. I imagine over, you know, the first few years that this is run, that there'll be, you know, kind of heavy analysis done, and you know, tracking of what the experiences are of everybody that's involved, to make sure that it continues to be a safe environment, and because everybody obviously wants to ensure that it is safe, you know, for athletes participating in sport. In relation to the comment around Laurel being 130 kilos and 6 foot, as we've discussed several times before, you know, it's not that women can't be 6 foot. It's just that you know, the average height of men and women is different. And then the kilos, like if somebody is, you know, 130 kilos competing, is the makeup, like, it's not as if one of the women can't be 130 kilos. They can. It's just, is that their optimum performance weight? So that's just kind of an example. And I think the real point there is actually in relation to the differences, I guess, on averages in relation to, you know, your average height of a woman versus a man, what advantages you may have in particular sports for something like that. Because, you know, again, look at the Irish the Irish rowing team at the moment, some of the girls in that women's four, they're in and around that 6 foot mark. So it's not completely unusual for a woman to be 6 foot, but it is more unusual than it would be obviously for a man. Something that's quite, I guess, let's go on to the British Journal of Sports Medicine to give people a bit of context in relation to the potential advantages. So trans women retain a muscular advantage a year after testosterone is suppressed. Males typically have 20 to 100% advantage in mass and strength over females. And after taking testosterone suppressants, the advantage is only reduced by 5% after a year. So with France and that 12-month restriction or monitoring period, 5% after a year, it's not really a massive drop. And then there was running tests that were done, and they retained 12% advantage in running tests, even after 2 years of suppressants. So I think in relation to the research that's being done, like while some of the rulings have been around, say with the IOC since 2003, science has advanced massively in the last 18 years, and it's something that just needs more exploration done, more research, to establish like whether it is fair. We're talking about the nanomoles of testosterone, and while it's 10 for the IOC, and we're saying that for women it's the higher end of it is 1.79, like that's over 5 times the amount of testosterone that women have. And then even if you look at the 1.79 versus the 5 that France Rugby and World Athletics are doing, it's still more than twice the levels of testosterone. So yeah, look, there's a lot of research needs to be done in relation to performance and the reduction of testosterone. Performance does decline as the testosterone declines. While there is a decline, it's just about establishing whether the reduction is fair and if it's proportional to biological women, and if it's something that is fair for everybody to compete. And then there always seems to be like a bit of concern around specific sports, like the contact sports like rugby, MMA, boxing, American football. It is important to make sure that the safety of players is monitored. That's obviously a very important point. There is another kind of side to it in relation to transgender men. It doesn't get discussed often.
No, it doesn't,
because people are talking about the threats, and I think people don't see transgender men as a threat to elite sport. And I think they're happy enough for transgender men to participate in domestic or local sports because they don't really feel that they will have an advantage or that there's a safety threat. Obviously the conversation around elite sport, like people are there to there's a lot at stake, and obviously that's why there's more conversation and restriction, and it's more critically analysed. But yeah, I don't know what your kind of thoughts there are on that.
Yeah, look, it is something that is incredibly interesting that you bring up. I wonder, obviously sports, like male sports, is a very hyper masculine environment kind of going into. Like, I wonder, are the barriers to trans men going into male sports, I wonder, is it more social barriers that you would expect rather than actual physical and performance barriers that you would see in the women's game? I suppose we need to ask ourselves, and this is just me talking as someone who studied sociology, I suppose, in college, like, and all that kind of stuff. I think you'd have to ask yourself, like, would it be welcome, in terms of, like, socially? I think performance-wise, I think obviously you're transitioning, so you're going reverse, so you don't have to suppress yourself as much. If anything, you might have to add in some testosterone.
You're taking testosterone, yeah.
So it mightn't be as much of an issue, obviously, unless you hit that fine line where you are entering, like, WADA territory.
Are you doping? Yeah.
Yeah, which might be the only thing. But I think in terms of that, I think we might have to look at what are the barriers that exist for trans men that are currently going into sports. And I think a massive one at the moment is, and if you watch women's sports in general, it seems to be more welcoming to communities from LGBT backgrounds. I think we see that with women's sports. I think we see it to be a safer place, for women to come out, to be in relationships. Even if you look at the Irish women's national team, Katie McCabe and Ruesha Littlejohn, they're obviously together. If you look at even, the Barcelona women's team, that won the Champions League, a couple of them are together, so on and so forth. So I suppose women's sports would be more open for LGBT. Obviously, the T now is kind of question marked given everything that is, going on and, being discussed, and all that kind of stuff. But I suppose really, and again, this is just more my background as a sociologist, again, coming out, you'd want to be looking. We're obviously talking about performance, and that's incredibly important in sport. But we obviously have to look at kind of ethics as well and stuff in sport. Are we willing to say to someone, you can participate in sport if, and I get that there's a performance issue behind it. I'm not discrediting that entirely, but we do have to look at it from an ethical point of view. Are we willing to put people through incredibly costly surgeries, incredibly costly treatments, because all that stuff doesn't come cheap. Like I know in Ireland alone that if you want to go through a transition, and go from either or woman to man or man to woman, you actually have to go abroad because it's a lot cheaper. I've seen people that I would know who are transitioning, and they had to go to Poland during COVID times, and obviously they picked up COVID, and obviously they were at risks, higher risk because their immune system would have been suppressed and all that kind of stuff. So it really does raise, from my perspective anyways, interesting questions about like athlete welfare. And even on the flip side, if you wanted to flip that, it even raises questions about women in sport welfare in general. Like what are women going to do in order to win that gold medal if there is someone in the race or in whatever event it may be that is trans? Are they going to push themselves to a ridiculous level that the female body just can't handle anymore? I think we've seen so many documentaries and so many stories come out about athletes' bodies breaking down, because of certain things that they've been asked to do. So it is like, obviously, you're more up to the performance because you are someone who has competed at levels. You are, someone who would be more into that. Whereas, I'd be kind of raising ethical questions. I'd be like, is this what we are obviously all striving for as a society? But I think it would go back to the question of what is safe and what isn't safe. But I think it is very important to note that there is more research needed. And I think at the moment there's very fine lines, between you're either on this side or you're not on the side. And I think what we're trying to highlight is you can actually be in the middle, because I think at the end of the day, what you need to have the research behind you. You need to have the research done by people who are professional. I know a couple of, I don't think it was in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, but I think it was in a couple of other well-established papers of people who are incredibly transphobic actually submitting research and it being accepted and it writing horrific stuff about what you
that's not
really
on either. Do you know what I mean? You have to do the right science. And I think what you're saying in relation to ethics, like I completely agree. Like we have to, that's what I'm saying, we have to find something that suits everybody. And in relation to the sports that I was talking about earlier, like we know that there are some sports that people can compete at at elite level, and it doesn't matter what gender they are. And I know they're limited, and I would love somebody to tell me some additional sports. Equestrian is not limited. So if you want to participate in equestrian at elite level, go for it. There is space for you there. If you want to look at something like archery, there's mixed competition there. If you want to look at something like darts, there's mixed competition there. So there are a few sports that you actually could participate to a high level at, and you'd be welcomed because the gender doesn't come into it. I think in relation to the ethics and what you're talking about, like it's this, I think elite level is one thing, and that's going to be the difficult one to kind of navigate. And we can talk about some of the kind of suggestions that we have batted around before. But in relation to like what's going on domestically, like I think there's loads of room in terms of, something like mixed tag rugby, you have mixed soccer leagues, you can have lots of different things where there is room, and it's just about making like adaptations for whatever the competitions might be in some of your local sports to make sure that like everybody is given the opportunity to participate, to compete, and to enjoy themselves. And I think what you're saying actually in terms of the open-mindedness from women is really reflected by the poll that we did, because to be honest, I had actually expected it to be much I hadn't expected it to be 2/3 that were against oral competing and 1/3 for. I actually expected it to be much more against. But I think another thing that in relation to a poll like that, we obviously just put the question out there with not loads of detail on the background. And I think for people to make an informed decision, they actually need to understand the science and, the elite level. And I think that's why it was interesting that a lot of elite athletes didn't believe that it was something that was fair, because even from conversations that I've had with people around it, people say, oh yeah, sure, like of course, like that, it would be okay for her to compete because surely all the guidelines are kind of followed. And you kind of, that's where some of the, and that the research is done. And I think that's what people expect. But when you actually go looking into it, and there is a lack of research, and people are there, they're trying to do it, but there's not as much research done as people would think there is. We think it's something that has been well documented, well researched, but look, we even know from things that we talk about from women in sport that there's so many things that haven't been explored with women in sport. It's typically just men that the science has been explored,
and that's very reflective of science in general, like in the world. It's very much done. If you even think of like health sciences, and everything that's done, and even doctors would kind of tell you this, there's very limited research when it comes to the female like anatomy and like what women would need in comparison. Stuff with like nutrition, things you would really take for granted. It's increasing, but stuff you take for granted, like we are obviously, and some athletes are taking for granted here that the research is there. It's really funny, like, because it isn't there even from a sports kind of point of view. So I think that is actually just even reflective of the real life world scenario. And I think if you want to delve even deeper into it, I think it's incredibly reflective of society as a whole that we don't have even like trans research in general for like other stuff, like going on in the world. Obviously we know stuff about mental health rate, and all that kind of stuff, but we actually don't have anything even when it comes to, it's very limited on even like social, barriers, like barriers into employment, healthcare, all that kind of stuff. So of course for sport, it's going to be kind of down in the in the low, because people, I think just people aren't, not even like not aware, but I think people are just,
look, it costs money to do all these studies. Do you know what I mean? It's so expensive to do this. We know in terms of like sports science research that's been done on women, it's limited. So yes, it's going to be limited when it comes to transgender athletes as well. The reality of it is that there are less transgender people in the world than there are people, biological men, biological women. So you kind of have the pecking order of people are studying men, then they're studying women, and then they're probably studying transgender athletes. So we do hope to see more studies done about this. And I think because of the impact that it's going to have on sport, there will be more done. In terms of some of the research that's been done, I think another thing that's important to note is this is research that's been done on people that aren't athletes.
Yeah.
So something else that kind of comes up is if somebody is transitioning from being a man to a woman, and they want to compete at elite sport, they're already participating in sport, they love sport, whether it's intentional or not, if they continue to kind of participate in their weight training, in whatever sport they're participating in, like how much of a difference does that make during their testosterone suppressing, essentially? Because this has probably been done on people that aren't maybe, whether they're going to the gym and participating in sport or not, they're not doing it at an elite level. And we know that kind of even from the conversations around doping that sometimes there's a retained edge. So if someone kind of continues to train through their suppressing of their testosterone, what kind of impact does that have? Do they retain more muscle, more speed, more strength than your average transgender athlete, which then has to come into the conversation because they're actually the people that are going to be competing on the elite stage, not necessarily somebody, your typical transgender female. That's actually kind of where it really needs to go, which then obviously we need to have more transgender athletes competing at top level to really evaluate what the situation is there. But when you kind of talk about it, like, if you think about the levels that somebody is pushing into, you're going to have your biological women who are going to, let's say, I'm just going to pick a number of 120 kilos, right? Let's say they can lift 120 kilos and that's the most they've ever lifted. They're going to try, like, that's what their body has maxed out at, we call it. Then you have somebody that's transitioning from being a man to a woman, and let's say they have already reached over 130 kilos or 140 kilos, whatever it might be. That's the lift that they were able to do. So although they might be on testosterone suppressants, so that you're expecting a drop, but their body has actually experienced that heavier weight, or their body has experienced that speed, whatever it might be. They've already hit a threshold that a biological woman won't. unless they actually take performance enhancing drugs. So what kind of impact does that have? Because part of it is like you talk about like muscle memory and things like that, how much of that comes into it as well. And I think that goes back again to the elite athletes and how much does the kind of testosterone suppressant affect the overall picture, which is what is important when it comes to elite sport. I think something that was really interesting was Caitlyn Jenner spoke about this. She doesn't believe that transgender girls should be allowed to participate in girls' sports. She said, in an issue of fairness, we need to protect girls' sports in our schools. So I think to give context for this, in America, there's been a lot going on in relation to transgender sport. Donald Trump's administration had views that trans women athletes shouldn't be allowed to compete in girls or women's sports, whereas since coming into the presidency, Joe Biden's administration think that they should be allowed. Some states are trying to pass bills to stop them from being allowed to compete, and there's just a lot of conversation going on over there. At the moment in high schools, anybody that identifies as a woman can participate, or a woman or a girl can participate in female sports. So I think that's really a key to what Caitlyn Jenner is saying, because somebody hasn't undergone any transitioning other than they are now living as a girl or a woman, but they haven't actually had any kind of physical alterations at this point.
Yeah.
So realistically, like you still do have the male body competing against a female body, which is quite difficult for young girls to take on, and we're already trying to keep young girls in sport and encourage them to participate. So I think that's where Caitlyn Jenner is kind of weighing in on it. And it's really interesting from her perspective, because as we know, Caitlyn Jenner was previously Bruce Jenner, competing at the Olympic Games and has a gold medal in the decathlon. So I think if anybody has an understanding of the full picture, it is somebody like Caitlyn Jenner who has given this feedback. Joanna Harper also had an opinion, if you want to tell us about Joanna Harper.
Yeah, so Joanna Harper is a medical physicist. Physicist. Joanna Harper is a medical physicist. She previously spoke about, her role, and everything. She's also a transgender runner in 2019. She said that gender identity doesn't come into it, but the testosterone levels actually do. Trans girls should have the right to compete, but also cisgender girls have the right to succeed too. So I suppose really, and what the overall theme of this podcast is, which, we will probably not find an answer, not in a bad way, but we are obviously asking the question of, how do you balance this? And I think at the end of the day, what you are trying to do is you're trying to be inclusive, you're trying to be competitive, and you're also trying to be fair among everything that's going on. And I think finding that balance, I think someone is going to get left behind. Someone is going to not.
You're not going to please everybody, but no. I think there is a solution. It's just a matter of finding the solution.
I think, it is definitely a thing where, I think if it's a case of that you need everyone to coexist and kind of work together. Whereas I think at the minute it's a lot of extremes, are kind of going on from all ends. I do want to kind of go back to the Caitlyn Jenner one, because I do think it is interesting, because I think a lot of trans women in particular feel that since obviously she has transitioned, she has kind of left behind a good chunk of trans women. She constantly kind of comes out with statements, that she would vote Republican, which obviously isn't exactly, pro-trans in a certain degree. She's obviously come out now with the statement of, that she doesn't think that transgender girls should be participating in sports in girls' schools anyways. And I think just she's a very divisive figure when it comes to the trans community, from everything that I have heard so far. So I think while she obviously does have the experience and is someone, that you could definitely ask questions to, I think you need to ask kind of questions about her and of her too, which is important as well. But I think this goes back to the whole, everyone has an opinion, everyone is trying to, as you said, try to make it fair, competitive and inclusive. And I think as I said earlier, someone isn't going to get, unfortunately, their way in this scenario. But I think, as you said, there is a solution to it. We're obviously not qualified in medical, sociology. We're just two women in sports, fans in particular, who are trying to make it inclusive and fair for everyone. But, we don't necessarily have the answers. I think it's incredibly tricky. And I think, as I said, someone is not going to be happy with the end result, I think, at some stage. But I think it's also a thing as well, like, I think society, like, does shift, you know, like, a part of me does think in, like, obviously we mightn't be alive, but if someone takes over the Horse Sport podcast in 100 years time, which I hope they do, I think, like, we're going to be like, how do I, like, describe it? Like, they're going to use our interviews and they're going to be like, geez, I can't believe, like, they were either, like, against it or, and we're not, but,
Yeah.
you know, they're going to, like, look upon us and be like, man, they were, like, so down the middle, but, you know, they're going to, like, look out into a track and there's going to be, like, a mix of girls, you know, like, participating, like, both trans and cis, and I think it's going to be, like, you know, incredibly, you know, weird to be looking back on these conversations. You know, I think that is something that I think just society will shift as a whole. That's my opinion. And I think
Yeah.
whether it either shifts with it and that we see more integration, or it shifts where it kind of divides and, you know, excludes transgender girls. I think that's something that will be seen in
I
years to
don't
come.
think I don't think it's a matter of exclusion. And like as I said, there's like different leagues and things that can kind of go on at domestic level that can include everybody, and it's a matter of having mixed teams and making things fair. I think something that does need to be explored is kind of like the system that is used for the Paralympics, where everybody doesn't necessarily have the same disability, but people
Yeah.
are able to be put in categories in a way that's fair for everybody competing, that everybody gets a shot, and you know, and like it's fair,
Yeah.
and that's the way it's been done. Like, you know, obviously, like we're huge supporters of our Paralympians here, and we've seen, you know, great success, and it's brilliant that there are different categories for people, like each person to get an opportunity to be competitive in a fair environment, and I
Yeah.
think that's kind of what's going to be need to be looked at. So we can learn something from that. So let's explore, like, how was that done? Maybe in some sports, you know, biological women and transgender women can compete on a level playing field. And something that I would actually say is possible in ultra marathons and like long distance running, like really, really long distance
Yeah.
running,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
sometimes women are actually winning outright. So they're beating the men.
Yeah.
So women's bodies are a little bit more
Endurance.
endurance based and kind of structurally suited for some of these kind of extreme distances, we'll call them, like the very, very long
Yeah.
distances
It's really interesting. Yeah.
that the lovely Katrina Jennings is competing in. But people are like women, biological women are winning some of these races outright. So maybe that's something there where if somebody's actually competing in that no kind of adjustments or something like that needs to happen, you know. And then you need to look at some of these other sports that we've mentioned in terms of, you know, rugby and boxing and that type of thing. And maybe there is kind of, you know, look, there's like, you're talking about golf, like people play off handicaps in golf. So maybe there is a couple of different like ways that we can look at making things fair
Yeah.
in different sports that everybody can be accommodated. There is a concern from a lot of people in terms of what's going to happen to women's sport, and is it going to be destroyed, essentially. Like people are worried about it, and I know that sounds dramatic, but we're talking about elite level, and then you are talking about like you know, underage levels, domestic competition, and you know, really, if people are, it's all kind of in context. So while lots
Yeah.
of people will look at the elite level and think that that's the most important thing, for your 15-year-old girl, her football match is the most important thing for her. And if
Yeah.
she feels like she's going up, and like the thing in the high schools in the US, if they don't have to undergo any hormone therapy yet, it's kind of a bit disheartening for somebody to feel like they're going up against somebody that has an advantage over them, and there's nothing they can do about it, because that is essentially what it is. And you know, at that point in their life, that's the biggest thing for them, and they mightn't be able to see the bigger picture. And you know, are they going to make it to elite level? Like loads and
Yeah.
loads of people don't make it to elite level, and that's the biggest thing in their world. So I think when Caitlyn Jenner is talking about that, like, you have to consider, like, we're trying to encourage people to participate in sport, and women to stay in sport, and this might be something that hampers kind of the progression
And
um
development.
in retaining people. And we do want a space for everybody, but I think the way personally to go is looking at the mixed events, and that type of thing, and then looking at different systems where kind of adaptations can be made in different sports to accommodate everybody and make it fair for everybody. I think, as we were kind of saying earlier, you know, we had like transgender people in the world are a minority, and then also within that society you have the people that want to participate in sports. So it actually reduces, because not everybody that's transgender wants to participate in sport in the first place. Because like people have bounced around the idea of like, could we have a transgender games? And you know, something like that should definitely be explored. But like, are we going to have enough athletes? Because like, if we think about like transgender you know, athletes in Ireland, like, have we enough transgender athletes in Ireland to participate in something like a soccer league? Is there enough interest? And then the thing about it is, like, we're talking about, say, soccer, but people have the different sports, and there's so many different sports out there, which obviously is brilliant. But part of it then is like, how do you kind of make some sort of games or competitions that you know, that it's not like how many different sports are there in the world? Like, you're going to have to start. And actually, I do think that that's there. Like, maybe you pick 10 sports, and they're the sports that you can compete at elite level in if you're a transgender athlete, and it kind of gives some scope for developing a games. And I think, you know, obviously, you know, transgender, like, people transitioning at the moment is increasing because people are more accepting of it now, and there is more kind of support there, and kind of just society is changing. So I think over the next 20 or 30 years, we will see more people transitioning because it has become more accepted in society. So maybe we start off with 10 sports and it develops and develops and develops because there becomes more interest over the next 20 or 30 years. But look, it's certainly a huge topic. We're going to see lots and lots of change over the next couple of years. I think we will see change at elite level first, and then we will see accommodations being made at domestic level. In terms of France, look, they have the research from World Rugby, they have whatever, and they made their decision. And you know, one has to respect that. And I don't think that they're going to be irresponsible in terms of you know, welfare, player welfare for everybody, as what we said is you know, the most important thing. But yeah, I don't know, have you any kind of final thoughts on the topic?
No, but I think definitely, as you said, the French rugby situation, I think, is one definitely to watch out for. Like, it's definitely a place if you wanted to do your research and see, and like maybe physically see it for yourself. It is definitely one to watch out for and to see, because I think at the moment it is the only real life situation that we can apply, you know, to future. It's the precedent, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, that it's setting at the moment. And I think that is incredibly important. I think someone eventually does have to stick their nose out or raise their hand and even say, look, I'll do it. You know, like, I'll test it up against, you know, 6 women. I'll see if it makes a difference, and then, you know, see what happens. And I think once we start seeing that, and once then people, you know, start seeing the research, we can get behind it, and we can do more studies and do all that kind of stuff. I think more informed opinions can be made, rather than some, you know, incredibly radicalized, you know, stuff that I suppose that we're hearing at
Yeah.
the moment. But
Look,
yeah, I think overall it is something. It's a hopefully a progressing area, and hopefully it will be progressive, as you said, in time. Maybe a situation that can arise, as you said, going back to your trans games, let's call them. You know, maybe a situation can arise where we could put the winners of whatever category, maybe 100 meters in men and women's, up against 100 meters trans men, trans women, and see, you know, what kind of happens, you know, from there. And then you can obviously do more research and do more studies. I think it's not a bad idea, and I think, as you said, these ideas have happened somewhere. It happened with the Paralympics. And like you said, this is even going back to even people with disabilities. Not all people with disabilities want to compete in sport. You know, I'm a sports
yeah.
fan. I don't want to compete, and that's totally fine. You know, as you said, and it's the same with you know, people who are transitioning, or you know, people who are fully transitioned. Not all of them are going to want to compete. We're basically going to estimate here, if you're going to take the general population of the world, you could probably say maybe what, 10% are sports fans. You know, well, you could maybe say more. Let's say maybe like, you
More
know,
sports fans, maybe less athletes.
maybe, yeah. So like, and then you're talking 1% of the global population actually turn into an elite athlete. So as you said, this goes back to the question of, if you've got maybe, I don't know, 5 trans athletes in Ireland, maybe they all don't want to do 100 meters. Maybe they all don't
Yeah.
want to do five
But
aside.
people want to do different sports, and like,
Yeah.
that's totally fair. And look, I think the main thing at the moment in terms of what is trying to be solved internationally is obviously it's the elite level. Like that's what they're trying to do at the Olympics. And the reason that it has come out more now as conversation is because now we have the first person that's looking like they might qualify.
Yeah.
And the same in the rugby, yeah, look, like people are trying to find accommodations for everybody, and there's been lots of conversation about it online, particularly as this new rugby piece has come out as well. It really is just about figuring out what's going to work. And I think, although it might not be what, people in the transgender community are happy with, it is a little bit of a sit tight for the next couple of years. Like keep pushing the boundaries, keep talking to people about it and see what can be done. But I think, understanding also needs to come from both sides. Everybody kind of needs to understand the picture and kind of, like you're talking about, it being fair for everybody, and that's what we're trying to do. We'd love to hear opinions and thoughts on this. Like there's so much more to explore. If you've new information or science, like we definitely love to hear it and share it with the audience. And what we will do is try and have transgender athletes on this to talk about what it's like, what they think in terms of this conversation. And then I guess we may also try and have some of the elite athletes on if they're comfortable. Athletes that are going to the Olympic Games or competing on international level in terms of what it would be like for them to come up against a transgender female, and would they feel at a disadvantage because of that. But yeah, I think that's kind of where we have it for today, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. And don't forget to hit us up, I suppose, on social media with the Hersport crew at hersport.ie on Twitter and Instagram, and at JoannaWar_OX on Twitter, and at JoannaWar. So hit us up with your feedback, whatever it is you want to hear. If you have any suggestions about athletes, we would definitely love to hear those as well. And if you have any thoughts and opinions, feel free to send them our way as well. We'd love to hear what you're definitely thinking about. So yeah, Niamh, very insightful conversation. We definitely have come up with some answers, but we hope we've provided a lot of people with food for thought and definitely something to think about over the course of the next few weeks. And we look forward to seeing the progression as well of Laurel Hubbard in the weightlifting category as well, and see what she does and how she progresses. So yeah, Niamh, on that note, enjoy.
Cheerio.
Cheerio.